Hi, everybody. Ken Kirschbaumer, editorial director of the Sports Video Group. I'm here to discuss HDR with one of my great friends, Roger Charlesworth with the DTV Audio Group. Roger, how are you?
Oh, I'm great, Ken.
Roger, you and I have been discussing HDR at length for the last couple of years. Obviously, a lot of progress has been made in the last couple of years, but we are having a symposium with some leaders in the industry to discuss the HDR workflows, how it's going to keep moving forward, how it's going to gain some momentum. And I guess the first question I have for you is, you are the head of the DTV Audio Group, so why is DTV Audio Group getting involved with high dynamic range?
Well, Ken, audio is a really small community, and there's a lot of cooperation, sort of sharing good ideas, sharing best practices. This kind of grew out of a discussion we were having after our Detroit seminar, and we were together with Netflix and ESPN, NBC, HBO, a bunch of other people. And somebody said, well, I wish we could get a group together to talk about HDR in the same way. And we sort of thought about it, and NBC has been incredibly generous in sharing information about ramping up for the Olympics and other stuff that they've done. And Chris Seeger in particular has given seminars and talks, and NBC's helped Apple and Amazon and other people kind of ramp up live HDR production. Everybody really loved the idea. As audio people, what we've seen over the decades is this sort of filtering down of audio technology from cinema to premium episodic to live sports and entertainment.
Roger, one of the things, obviously, from my standpoint, is that there has been a correlation between the audio people who have driven surround sound and what have you, in terms of immersive audio experiences, and HDR is an immersive video experience. So I think they kind of have to almost go hand in hand.
Yeah, and I think we've seen in audio this sort of history of audio technologies in filtering down from cinema to premium episodic HBO and whatnot, and on to live sports. We've seen that in stereo, we saw that in 5.1, and we saw it in Atmos. When we started talking about Atmos for live sports 5 or 6 years ago, people thought we were crazy. And now it's not commonplace, but it's done a lot. Coming back to HDR sort of fits into the same pattern. And we're probably about halfway through that. It's come down from cinema. We're seeing it in cinema-derived content and premium episodic on Netflix or HBO. But we're just starting to see it in sports.
Obviously, the World Cup was a big driver. You mentioned Karl Malone, the Olympics. These big global events kind of really pushed a lot of the move towards, obviously, HD, HDR, 4K, surround sound, Atmos. Those are the events that have kind of pushed a lot of the U.S. broadcasters into it. I know Fox has adopted a lot of it here in the U.S. and NBC as well. But what do you see as far as here in the U.S. as far as we have college sports from Fox? We have, obviously, the World Cup was done. The Super Bowl was done in HDR. What do you see as this whole push on the here in the domestic market?
Some people are really starting to gear up. And, I do think it's about what that target is. We now have the living room that has really great 4K Dolby Vision TV. You've got a Atmos soundbar. That's all get that stuff very reasonably at Best Buy. And that kind of becomes the target. And HBO, Netflix, Amazon, Apple, all of those people are pumping premium pre-produced content there. So when we put up regular SDR content against it, it doesn't look so good.
Right.
And so I think it's really important for all of these live sports brands to be represented in the best way possible.
This reminds me very much of the early days of the move to HD.
Yeah.
So you and I would get in a room, we'd argue about 720p versus 1080i. Remember those?
Yeah,
days?
And I think we're starting to see people coalescing around these sort of single source workflows. And you look at NBC or HBS or Fox on the World Cup, and they're using a very similar workflow.
Right.
And we're also seeing sort of coalescing around distributing with dynamic metadata. So even if something is produced in HLG, for instance, I think we look at Comcast then taking content that's produced in HLG and encoding it in Dolby Vision to ensure that there's sort of a more consistent experience and to maximize the quality of that content, I guess, or secure the quality of that content.
Sure. Well, let's go back a couple of years, right? So HDR is starting. Nobody really has a defined workflow.
Yep.
To your point, it was a lot of dual workflows, right? So how do we get into this single stream? How important is it that the industry seems to have coalesced around a single stream workflow for both the SDR show, which is the standard dynamic range, and the HDR show in terms of making it affordable and practical?
Well, I think that's the thing is like NBC has proved and Fox have proved that this can be done at scale and efficiently. And I think that there's a sort of misconception that it's going to be more expensive. It's a big lift for the production. And I think the thing about a single stream workflow with sort of a predictive down mapping is that it is really as efficient as doing SDR. You know, the thing today, we have the cameras have this incredible dynamic range, and why wouldn't you take advantage of that?
Right. Let's look forward to the NAB convention in April. Do you think HDR is going to be a big topic of discussion across the show floor?
Well, I think so. I think that's where we're going. Right now, there's a lot of turbulence. I think there are a lot of people in certain places who have sort of a rabbit ears broadcast mentality. And the thing is that television is really changing, and it's changing really fast. And the television has changed, and the living room has changed. And I think some people in our business are a little slow to recognize that. Mm-hmm. But, you know, the direct-to-consumer thing, though, is a big driver for this. As this content migrates to direct-to-consumer platforms, those platforms take advantage of the technology that's in the living room. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why it's important for sports and live entertainment to keep up with that.
Have you talked to anybody who is not doing HDR as far as what their reticence is?
I think it's not so well understood. So I think there's sort of anxiety about it. But again, there's also sometimes a lot of inertia around the linear broadcast. Right. And the tail kind of wags the dog there. With the World Cup or with Olympics or with the Super Bowl on Fox, seeing a huge take up on the 4K. And that's only and HDR, and that's only going up. People watch a lot of content on smart TV. And I think there's a kind of conventional wisdom, everybody's watching things on their phones. No, as soon as they get in the living room, they're watching on their smart TV. And smart TV really enables a direct-to-consumer experience, and it enables the sort of automatic highest quality experience. But every, iOS tablet or smartphone has HDR. I think that whether it's a mobile experience or whether it's, it's a 2-foot experience, the 10-foot experience, it's still likely to be an HDR-enabled experience. And increasingly, also, by the way, an Atmos-enabled experience.
People watching this may be wondering not why DTV Audio Group is doing HDR, but if they have questions about HDR, should they contact you? Do we expect the DTV Audio Group to kind of continue to do HDR symposiums once a year or so to kind of bring it together?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, I think this issue is really close to our heart. When we started talking about Atmos 5 or 6 years ago, people thought we were out of our minds, But HDR is a little bit, HDR is a little bit like that. It's come down from cinema, and now it's in cinema-derived content, almost all cinema-derived content, almost all premium episodic content is in Dolby Vision. And it's live sports and entertainment that are just sort of there on the edge.
Right.
And right now it's just special events. It's the Olympics. It's the World Cup. But I think eventually it'll be certainly all premium sports.
Do you think there is a responsibility to deliver HDR content, given that consumer sets are HDR capable?
I think that it's sort of about the target. You're going up against content that is in 4K, Dolby Vision, and Atmos. And that's what When somebody stops watching the game and they watch a movie at home on Netflix or whatever, Disney Plus, that's what they're watching.
Right.
So if you're putting sports content on that same platform, it needs to be just as good. And if you're a brand, if you're the NBA or NFL or whatever, aren't you just as important a brand as Marvel or Pixar? Or like, don't you want your brand represented as best as it can? And that's the sort of trend we've seen in Europe with Premier League, with Bundesliga.
So we're going to have this conference where we're going to have different stakeholders discuss their philosophy around HDR. Do you feel that by the end of the day, everyone will feel like, hey, we're all relatively close to being on the same page? Or do you think that at the end of the day, it'll feel like, oh my God, we're more fractured than ever?
I think people like NBC and Fox have been on a journey here, and they've learned a lot and studied a lot, and I think we're sort of starting to coalesce around some concepts, and one of which is this sort of single stream predictive down mapping kind of workflow that's super efficient and yet yields very high quality, and has proved to be very scalable. So I think what we need to get is sort of coalesce around some commonalities in workflow that will allow everybody to scale up as efficiently as possible.
The industry should take a lot of credit for getting to this point so quickly. Because if you go back again to HD, the early days, you had HDR trucks, you had HD TV trucks next to the SD trucks. And that took years, and I think that HDR has become so efficient in a matter of, let's call it 3 years, right? Probably beginning with like the Tokyo Olympics. What's your take as far as the progress that's been made as far as just really getting to that point?
I think the difference too is the consumer is there already. And as you said, if somebody shoots something on their phone, they're shooting HDR. And so the consumer has all these 4K HDR Atmos enabled devices. And what we need to do is make content to go on.
The cool thing is that I think as consumers, they're all on board with this concept. It's not like they don't understand the beauty of real reds and understanding, true spatial audio. So I think people kind of have to remove that whole gating factor as well.
Absolutely. And again, Atmos music is a huge hit. Immersive people are very interested in immersive experiences. And we just need to take advantage of an appetite that the consumer already has.
So as far as this meeting tomorrow, we have a few stakeholders. It's not a big room. So our goal is not to bring in hundreds of people to get on board and become converts of HDR and Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos. So what do you see as the current state as far as getting the right stakeholders in the room to really kind of create some real change as opposed to trying to have a big, massive event for 500 people at NEB?
Well, I think there are currently a small number of folks at the network who are actually dealing with HDR. And I think we benefit by bringing these people together to share a common understanding and help the rest of us come up to speed and scale up efficiently.
So Roger, one question I have is, obviously we're focusing on the big networks, the big cable distributors, but you mentioned DTC, direct-to-consumer, is offering a really great way to deliver HDR content. And there's a lot of smaller independent federations, leagues, teams that are creating content but aren't doing HDR content. What's your understanding as far as the marketplace? How many consumers do you think are consuming or are capable of consuming HDR, and should they be doing HDR because that number is much larger than we think?
There's something like 70% of all TVs sold in the last 5 years are HDR capable. All the 4K sets sold now are HDR capable. Everybody has multiple TV sets, and consumers are already having these experiences on their Apple TVs or their Rokus or smart TVs. And as the consumer sort of migrates to viewing direct-to-consumer content in sports, then I think it's going to flow to them automatically. And it's really in your interest to aim for that target. That's the consumer experience.
Right. Do you think that if you were a content creator, regardless of budget, do you think you'd be seriously considering HDR? Because it does not seem as if HDR is a big cost factor.
I think the single stream workflows have proved that with current equipment, we can do HDR at the same time we're doing SDR for literally no added cost. And there's been a whole lot of innovation around these workflows, and the latest Sony cameras have capabilities that make it easier and easier, for instance. So I think there's no reason not to do HDR.
What's your take as far as where we are with the discussions around HDR as far as artistic intent? So, for example, movie directors love this because there's the potential for them to finally give their color palettes and sort of their tones that they kind of look for in their saturation and the way they approach color as a emotional tool. But the sports side, I don't think we've had those conversations. So what do you think is ahead of us as far as the fun of having those? Because those are the fun discussions.
Well, I think there's some interesting stuff that's coming in terms of graphics and editing as we sort of develop those workflows so we can do interesting things with HDR. But I think it's partly just presenting the reality of the situation. So if we encode in Dolby Vision with active metadata, then we exactly control the set, and different televisions will look the same. We have a much more consistent experience.
Yeah.
I think we're sort of on the cusp of scaling this up, and I think we'll benefit from commonality of workflow in production and distribution. And if we can get together and talk about these things, we'll be able to move faster and more efficiently.
Well, Roger, thanks again for joining us today to discuss HDR. Very important topic. And obviously your leadership on this has been really impressive and just I love what we're doing. So thanks again for your time today and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks, Ken. It's been a pleasure.